The pain was not a guest anymore. It was the landlord, and today the rent was overdue. I stood in the center of the Hall of Iridescence, a chamber carved from a single, gargantuan shard of bioluminescent crystal that pulsed with a rhythmic, sickly violet light. My right hip felt as if someone had driven a heated piton into the joint and was rhythmically striking it with a sledgehammer. My spine was a column of jagged glass. Rheumatoid arthritis at 34 is a cruel joke, especially when you are a military attaché representing the Terran Union to a race of 7-foot-tall, silver-skinned titans who haven't seen a biological defect in 3,000 years. I had been standing at attention for 3 hours and 42 minutes. I knew the timing because I counted my heartbeats to keep from fainting. Every pulse of the crystal walls seemed to mock my frailty. Around me, the Corinthian nobles hovered like predatory angels, their skins shifting from polished chrome to deep obsidian depending on their level of boredom. Their clothing was made of woven light, flowing like water, emphasizing bodies that were the peak of genetic engineering. In their eyes, I was a primitive, a biological error, a relic of a species that still allowed its cells to decay. "Tell me, little soldier," a voice boomed, echoing off the vaulted ceiling where artificial constellations swirled. High Strategist Vera sat upon a throne that looked like it had been grown from frozen lightning. She leaned forward, her eyes, the color of molten copper, fixed on me with terrifying intensity. "Why is it that your species sends a broken blade to a house of master smiths? You have not moved an inch, yet I can hear your breath hitching. I can see the micro-tremors in your hands. Are you malfunctioning?" A ripple of laughter, like the sound of glass bells, went through the assembly. The walls flared a bright, mocking yellow. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as the Martian deserts. I could have played the diplomat. I could have lied. But the pain was too sharp for politeness. It stripped away the filter. "I'm not malfunctioning, Your Radiance," I said, my voice rasping but steady. I managed a tight, jagged smile. "It's called chronic inflammation. My body is currently at war with itself. It's a very intimate conflict, very exclusive. No outsiders allowed." The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like atmospheric pressure. Vera's copper eyes narrowed. "You joke about your own deterioration? In our empire, a warrior whose body fails him is granted the mercy of the long sleep. To exist in a state of decay is considered the ultimate dishonor. Why do you persist?" "Because dying is easy, Strategos," I replied, and I felt the words bubbling up from a place of deep, exhausted honesty. Living while every nerve is screaming quit at you? That takes a special kind of stubbornness. Besides, if I were as perfect as a Corinthian, I wouldn't have anything to complain about at the bar. And what's a soldier without a good gripe? Vera stood. The movement was so fluid it looked like cinematography. She descended the stairs of her dais, her silver skin shimmering under the violet light. She stopped less than a foot from me. The heat radiating from her was immense, smelling of ozone and expensive minerals. She was a god of war, and I was a man who needed a cane just to get to the bathroom in the morning. "You speak of pain as if it were a companion," she whispered, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "It's more like a clingy ex-wife, Your Radiance," I muttered. "She doesn't want me, but she won't let anyone else have me either." She didn't laugh this time. She reached out, her long, elegant fingers hovering near my shoulder, where the shrapnel scars from the scorched divide lay hidden beneath my dress uniform. The walls of the hall suddenly turned a deep, bruised indigo, the color of profound confusion. "Show me," she commanded. "Your Radiance, the marks of your intimate conflict. Show this court what it means to be a Terran survivor." I hesitated. My commanding officer back on Lunar Station would have had a stroke. But I was tired of being the joke. I was tired of pretending that my medals meant more than my scars. I unbuttoned my jacket with shaking fingers. My hands were stiff, the knuckles swollen, but I didn't stop. I pulled off the shirt, standing there in the cold, crystalline air of a world that hated weakness. My torso was a map of disasters. The long, jagged white line where a plasma lance had opened me up, the puckered craters of shrapnel spray, the surgical incisions where they had tried to stabilize my spine with titanium rods that my body had spent the last decade trying to reject. The nobles gasped. Their skin turned a chaotic, flickering gray, the Corinthian sign of visceral disgust. This, I said, pointing to the mess on my chest, is Orion's reach. This, I touched the scar on my side, is the siege of Vesta. And the pain in my joints, that's the interest I pay for the privilege of still breathing. I looked Vera in the eye. I didn't look for pity. I didn't look for mercy. I just stood there, my right knee buckling slightly, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Vera reached out and pressed her palm against the largest scar on my shoulder. Her touch was electric. "The law of the unscarred says we are perfect because we do not break," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "But this human has broken 1,000 times, and yet he stands before us. He mocks his own frailty because he has conquered the fear of it. There is a dignity in this decay that our silver halls have forgotten." She turned back to the nobles, her eyes blazing like twin suns. "I invoke the vow of the shards." The hall erupted. Nobles were shouting, their skin flashing, frantic orange. Guards stepped forward, their energy pikes humming. An elder noble with skin the color of tarnished lead screamed, "High Strategos, you cannot. He is a subkin, a primitive. To bind your soul to a broken thing is heresy." "I am the High Strategos," Vera roared, and the crystal walls turned a blinding, terrifying white. "I have led your fleets through the void for 200 years without a single scratch. And I am bored of perfection. I claim this man as my shield consort, my iron soul. By blood and shard, he is mine." She turned back to me, her expression unreadable. "Do you accept, Elias Thorne? Or would you rather return to your people and wait for your joints to turn to dust?" I looked at her, then at the room full of beautiful, immortal beings who looked at me like I was a cockroach. I thought about the desk job waiting for me on Luna, the pitying looks of my superiors, and the slow, quiet death of a retired soldier. "Well," I said, my voice cracking slightly, "I've always been a fan of bad ideas. I accept your radiance. But fair warning, I'm a terrible dancer, and I'm going to need a lot of aspirin." Vera smiled, a sharp, dangerous thing. "We shall find you better medicine than aspirin, my iron soul." She grabbed my hand, her grip like a vice, and as our skin met, the living crystal of the palace let out a low, thrumming vibration that I felt deep in my marrow. It was the sound of a world changing, or perhaps it was just the sound of my life finally breaking in a way that couldn't be fixed. The quarters they gave me were large enough to house a small platoon of Terran Marines, but they felt like a very expensive cage. Everything was made of that damn Luma glass. The bed was a floating slab of pressurized gas and soft light that adjusted to my body temperature, which was great, except for the fact that I felt like I was sleeping on a cloud of judgment. I woke up at 0500 hours, not because I had a mission, but because my nerves decided it was time for the morning fireworks show. I sat on the edge of the floating bed, my hands locked into claws. "Status check, Elias," I whispered to the empty room. Right knee, foobar, left shoulder, holding steady at a dull throb. Spirit, currently MIA. I looked at the wall. It was a soft, soothing green. Apparently the room thought I was peaceful. The room was a liar. There was a chime at the door, a melodic, three-tone sequence that sounded like a harp being struck by a falling star. "Enter," I croaked. The door didn't slide. It dissolved into a mist of light and then reformed. High Strategos Vera walked in. She wasn't wearing her liquid mercury armor today. Instead, she wore a robe of woven shadow that seemed to swallow the light around her. Out of her armor, she looked less like a god and more like a very tall, very tired woman. "You are awake early, Shield Consort," she said. "I have an early appointment with a localized lightning storm in my lower back," I replied, struggling to stand. I refused to let her see me crawl. I gripped the edge of a Luma glass table, my knuckles white. She watched me, her copper eyes tracking every labored movement. "In the hall yesterday, you spoke with a courage that silenced the council. Here in the dark, you look like a man waiting for execution. That's the secret of the Terran infantry, Vera," I said, finally managing to straighten my spine. The pain was so sharp I saw spots of light that weren't part of the room's decor. "We're all waiting for execution. We just try to make sure the executioner has to work for it." She stepped closer. The green walls shifted to a pale, inquisitive amber. "My healers have looked at your medical files. The data they retrieve from your embassy. They say your condition is a result of your own immune system attacking your connective tissues. Why would your own life force seek to destroy you? Glitch in the software, I said, shrugging, then immediately regretted it as my shoulder spiked. Evolution is a messy process. Sometimes the body gets confused. It thinks the joints are invaders, so it tries to burn them out. It's a design flaw. A flaw we erased millennia ago, she mused. She reached out, her fingers brushing the air near my face. Yet there is a strength in you that my officers do not possess. They are fast, yes. They are strong. But they have never known the weight of a body that betrays them. They do not know how to fight when they are losing. Is that why you picked me? A social experiment? Her eyes flared. The walls turned a sharp defensive red. I picked you because the High Council has become soft. They sit in their silver towers and talk of the law of the unscarred, while the edges of the hegemony are fraying. They have forgotten that a blade is forged in fire and hammered until it is thin and sharp. They are all hammer and no fire. You, Elias Thorne, you are nothing but fire. She sat on the edge of my floating bed, a gesture of informality that felt like a breach of protocol. The council is already moving against the vow. They believe I have brought a parasite into the obsidian spire. Lord Kalen, the one with the skin of tarnished lead, has filed a formal challenge to your status. A duel? I asked, my heart sinking. I'm a crack shot with a pulse rifle, Vera. But if he expects me to do any of that wuxia jumping off the wall stuff your people do, he's going to be disappointed. Not a duel of blades. A test of utility, she explained. In 3 days, there will be a hunt in the shifting wilds. You must survive. You must prove that your iron soul is more than just a clever phrase. I let out a short, dry laugh. A hunt. Terrific. Is there a getting eaten by alien monsters clause in my contract? If you fall, the vow is void. I lose my command, and you will be processed as a subkin and sent to the atmosphere processing plants on the moon of Voros. You would last 6 hours in those conditions. Right. Voros. Sounds lovely this time of year. I looked down at my swollen hands. I need equipment, Vera. I can't hunt like a Corithian. I'm too slow, too fragile. If I'm going to survive, I have to fight like a human. And how does a human fight when his body is a prison? I looked up at her, and for the first time, the sarcasm was gone. There was only the cold, hard logic of a man who had survived 3 major engagements with nothing but a combat knife and a bad attitude. We cheat, I said. We use every dirty trick in the book. We use gravity, we use traps, and we use the enemy's arrogance against them. If you want me to win this hunt, I need access to your fabrication labs. I need to build some things that your perfect warriors wouldn't dream of using. Vera leaned in, her copper eyes reflecting my own tired face. The labs are yours. But know this, Elias. The shifting wilds are not a forest. They are a living ecosystem of predatory crystal. It reacts to sound, to heat, and to fear. Can you hide your fear when your bones are screaming? Vera, I said, leaning back against the wall, I've been hiding my pain from the world since I was 22. Fear is just a different flavor of the same headache. I can handle it. She stood up, her robe swirling like smoke. The walls of the room turned a deep, resonant gold, the color of a pact made in the dark. 3 days, she said. Don't die, shield consort. I am starting to enjoy your company. It would be a shame to have to find another jester. Don't worry, I called out as she faded through the door. I'm too stubborn to die. It would be a blow to my ego. When she was gone, I slumped back onto the bed. The pain was there, waiting for me, a familiar shadow. I looked at the ceiling, at the artificial stars that didn't know anything about human suffering. 3 days, I whispered. Time to show these silver gods what a broken man can do when he's pushed into a corner. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't think about the ache in my knees. I thought about the fabrication labs. I thought about tripwires, motion sensors, and high-velocity projectiles. If they wanted a hunt, I'd give them one. But they were going to learn a very important lesson. You don't hunt a man who has already been through hell, because he knows the terrain better than you ever will. The fabrication sector of the Obsidian Spire was less of a workshop and more of a cathedral dedicated to the god of efficiency. It smelled of ozone, liquid nitrogen, and something metallic that reminded me of a dentist's office on a bad day. Everything was blindingly white, smoothed into curves that defied the jagged reality of physics. There were no hammers here, no grease, no welding sparks, just silent beams of hard light weaving matter into existence, as if they were composing a symphony out of atoms. I felt like a smudge of grease on a silk sheet as I limped through the primary bay. My right hip was giving me a particularly nasty greeting this morning, a sensation like a rusty, serrated knife being twisted into the bone. I had taken a double dose of my Terran-issued suppressants, but they were about as effective as throwing a glass of water at a forest fire. My body was an old, rattling engine trying to keep up with a fleet of starships, and the Corithian engineers knew it. They didn't look at me. They looked through me. To them, I was a biological snafu, a walking reminder of what happens when evolution takes a wrong turn and forgets to check the map. Who authorized this breach? The voice was like cold metal scraping against stone. I turned, or rather, I pivoted my whole body because my neck was too stiff to rotate independently. Standing there was a Corithian male whose skin was a dull, industrial matte gray. He was tall, even for his kind, and his eyes were a pale, washed-out silver. He looked like he'd been built specifically to calculate the trajectory of a genocide and find it mildly interesting. "Hi, Strategos Vera," I said, leaning my weight onto my good leg. I gave him a tired, lopsided grin. "I'm the new shield consort, Elias Thorne. I'm here for the party favors." The engineer's eyes flickered orange for a fraction of a second. Distaste. "You are the defective, the one she bound herself to in a moment of madness. You have no place here. This facility is for the creation of weapons of purity. You are an impurity." "Listen, Sparky," I said, and my voice took on that grating, military edge that usually meant someone was about to have a very long afternoon. "I've been called a lot of things. Broken, relic, primitive. But right now, I'm the guy your boss told you to assist. So unless you want to explain to Vera why you're obstructing her military directives, I suggest you point me toward the high-density polymer forge in a terminal with an open uplink." He stared at me for a long time. I could practically hear the gears of his superior intellect grinding against the sheer audacity of a human bossing him around. Finally, he stepped aside, the walls of the bay shifting to a reluctant, muddy brown. "The terminal is at Station 42. Do not touch the crystalline resonance emitters. If you destabilize the hard light loom, you will be vaporized, though perhaps that would be an improvement for your structural integrity." "I'll keep that in mind," I muttered, hobbling past him. "Thanks for the tip, gearhead." Station 42 was a sleek pedestal of light. I sat down on a floating stool, which immediately adjusted its height to a position that sent a fresh spike of agony through my lower back. I swore under my breath and forced the stool into a fixed, rigid position. Comfort was a lie I couldn't afford today. I opened my tactical files. The Corithians fought with elegance. They used gravity blades that could slice through reinforced steel and energy shields that could withstand a nuclear blast. But they were predictable. They fought with honor because they had never known the desperation of being outgunned and outmanned. They didn't understand the concept of a force multiplier. I started sketching. I didn't need a sword. I needed an equalizer. My rheumatism meant I couldn't dodge. I couldn't run. I couldn't engage in a prolonged melee. So I had to make sure the enemy never got close enough to see the sweat on my brow. I started with the boots. I needed something that would compensate for the tremors in my ankles and the grinding in my knees. I designed a set of kinetic assist braces, external skeletons that would lock my joints into place, and use the spire's own gravity grid to provide a burst of speed when I needed it. It wouldn't stop the pain, but it would stop my legs from buckling like wet cardboard. Next came the sensor array. The shifting wilds were a sensory nightmare. The Corithians relied on their natural vision, which could see into the infrared spectrum. I needed more. I programmed a multispectral visor that would track vibration, heat signatures, and atmospheric density. I wanted to see the monsters before they even realized I was on the menu. Finally, I designed the traps. Small, innocuous-looking spheres that would emit a high-frequency acoustic pulse. The crystalline plants of the wilds were sensitive to sound. At the right frequency, they would shatter. At another, they would grow at an accelerated rate. I was going to turn the environment into my own private minefield. I was deep into the schematics for a microfilament wire trap when I felt a presence behind me. I didn't turn around. I knew the smell of ozone and copper by now. "You are building toys of glass and wire," Vera said. Her voice was quiet, contemplative. "My warriors bring lances that can pierce the heart of a sun. You bring needles." "Needles are very effective when you know where to poke," I said, not looking away from the screen. "A sun lance is great if you're fighting a fleet. But if you're one man alone against a pack of predators who are faster than you don't want a lance. You want 1,000 little problems for the enemy to solve." She leaned over my shoulder, her silver skin inches from mine. The proximity sent a different kind of heat through me, one that made me forget the ache in my joints for a heartbeat. "What is this?" She pointed to a device that looked like a jagged piece of scrap metal. "That's a claymore," I explained. "Well, a Corinthian tech version of one. It's a directional anti-personnel mine. It doesn't look for honor. It doesn't look for a fair fight. It just waits for something to cross its path, and then it turns that something into Swiss cheese. Your methods are unsettling, Elias. There is no glory in a weapon that kills while the wielder is a kilometer away. Glory is for the guys whose names are on the monuments, Vera," I said, finally turning to face her. I stood up, the kinetic braces I had just started fabricating on the loom below, humming with a low, stabilizing power. "Survival is for the guys who get to go home and have a beer. You asked me to show your people who I am. Well, this is it. I'm a man who survives. And I survive because I know that I'm broken." She reached out and touched the flickering holographic schematic of the claymore. "You use your weakness as a blueprint. You assume you will be slower, so you make the world stop. You assume you will be weaker, so you make the world break." "Exactly. It's called being a grunt," I said. "We don't have the luxury of being silver gods. We have to be smarter than the dirt we're standing on." She looked at me then, her copper eyes searching mine. There was a flicker of something there. Not pity, but a deep, resonant understanding. It was the look of a commander who had just realized her most valuable asset wasn't a fleet of ships, but a single damaged soul who knew how to turn agony into an edge. "The hunt begins in 48 hours, she said. "The Council has chosen the sector of whispers for the trial. It is the most volatile region of the wilds. The crystal there is alive in a way that defies our biological understanding. It feeds on emotion. Then it's going to have a feast," I muttered. "Between my arthritis and my anxiety, I'm a 5-course meal." She didn't laugh. She simply rested her hand on my shoulder, her fingers warm and heavy. The walls of the lab shifted to a deep, protective violet. "Do not let them break you, Elias Thorne. Not because of the vow, but because I want to see what a man of fire does to a forest of glass." She turned and walked away, her robe trailing like a shadow across the white floor. I watched her go, then turned back to the terminal. I had 48 hours to build a miracle out of wire and spite. My right knee gave a sharp, agonizing pop as I sat back down. "Right," I whispered. No pressure. Just another day in the infantry. I spent the next 24 hours in a fever dream of engineering. I skipped the meals they brought me, vials of nutritional slurry that tasted like wet chalk, and focused on the gear. I fabricated a lightweight combat suit made of impact-resistant weave, reinforced at the joints with the kinetic assist motors. It felt like wearing a suit of armor made of angry bees, every movement accompanied by a high-pitched whine. But it worked. It held me together. I built the Equalizer, a modified pulse pistol that fired high-density acoustic rounds. It wouldn't kill a Corinthian noble, but it would shatter the crystalline trees they relied on for cover. It was a tool of chaos, and in the sector of whispers, chaos was going to be my best friend. As the sun of Korath Prime began to set, casting long amber shadows across the lab, the matte gray engineer returned. He looked at the pile of gear I had assembled, the braces, the visor, the jagged mines, the acoustic pistol. "You have created a collection of garbage," he said, though his eyes were no longer flashing orange. They were a neutral, curious gray. You have spent thousands of credits of high-grade material to build this. It's not garbage, I said, strapping the kinetic braces onto my legs. It's a message. And what does the message say? It says that being perfect is easy when you've never been hurt, I replied, testing the tension in the leg motors. But being a survivor, that's where the real work happens. I stood up, the braces whirring as they took the weight off my hips. For the first time in 10 years, I stood perfectly straight without feeling like my spine was going to snap. It was a lie, of course. The pain was still there, a hot coal buried deep in my flesh, but the suit was holding the coal in place. Tell the council I'm ready, I said, sliding the visor over my eyes. I've got a hunt to attend. And tell Lord Kalen to bring his best sun lance. He's going to need it. The engineer watched me walk toward the door. I didn't limp. The suit wouldn't let me. But every step was a calculated act of defiance, a human machine built of flesh and wire, walking into a world of glass. As I reached the exit, I paused. Hey, gearhead. He looked up. Thanks for the forge. It beats the hell out of the scrap heaps I'm used to. He didn't respond, but the walls of the lab flickered a very faint, very brief shade of green. Respect. Or maybe just a polite way of saying goodbye to a dead man. Either way, I'd take it. I had 24 hours to sleep before the screaming started, and for once I hoped I wouldn't dream. The shifting wilds were beautiful in the way a landslide is beautiful. A magnificent, terrifying display of power that didn't care if you lived or died. We stood on the edge of the sector of whispers, a vast basin filled with crystalline structures that looked like frozen lightning. The trees were translucent spears of quartz, their leaves serrated shards of amethyst that chimed in the wind. The ground was a fine silver sand that hummed with a low-frequency vibration, a sound that made my teeth ache and my knees throb in sympathy. The air smelled of static and cold iron. High above the sky of Korath Prime was a bruised purple, the two moons hanging like pale, unblinking eyes. The hunting party consisted of 12 Korithian nobles, each led by Lord Kalen. They were a vision of lethal elegance, draped in their mercury mesh armor, their sun lances glowing with a steady, golden light. They looked like they were attending a high-stakes opera rather than a hunt. And then there was me. I stood at the far end of the line, a clanking, whirring mess of black polymer and exposed wires. My kinetic assist braces hissed with every breath, and my multispectral visor sat like a heavy, unblinking third eye on my forehead. I carried a rucksack full of my improvised mines and my acoustic pistol holstered at my hip. I looked like a junkyard dog at a pedigreed kennel show. The rules are simple, Lord Kalen announced, his voice amplified by the crystalline walls of the basin. The target is a Vex predator, a beast of pure resonance. It is fast, it is invisible to the naked eye, and it is hungry. The one who brings the beast core to the high strategos wins the favor of the spire. The human, he turned his tarnished lead face toward me, his eyes glowing with a cruel orange light. The human simply has to survive until the sun reaches its zenith. If he fails, the vow is broken. If he interferes with a noble's hunt, he will be executed on the spot. I adjusted the strap of my rucksack, the movement causing a sharp, familiar jab in my shoulder. 12 hours, I muttered to myself. Just 12 hours of not being eaten or murdered. Easy peasy. Vera stood on a high ridge overlooking the basin, her silver skin stark against the dark sky. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her presence was a weight on the back of my neck, a reminder that I wasn't just fighting for my life, I was fighting for her reputation. The hunt begins, Kalen roared. The nobles blurred. They didn't run. They surged, their gravity manipulators allowing them to glide across the silver sand like skaters on ice. In seconds, they were gone, disappearing into the forest of glass like ghosts in a mirror. I didn't surge. I didn't blur. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, the motors in my boots whining as they stabilized my weight. My right knee gave a warning thud, a dull ache that promised to get worse as the day progressed. Keep your head on a swivel, Elias, I whispered. Stay frosty. I tapped the side of my visor. The world transformed. The beautiful, crystalline forest vanished, replaced by a wireframe map of thermal gradients and acoustic signatures. The silver sand wasn't just sand, it was a sea of data. I could see the heat trails left by the Corinthians, 12 golden streaks heading deep into the basin. But I also saw something else. The sector of whispers was alive. The trees weren't just standing there. They were pulsing, their internal structures vibrating in a complex polyrhythm. And in the center of that rhythm, there was a void, a cold spot that moved with a terrifying, jerky grace, the Vex predator. It wasn't heading for the nobles. It was circling. It was smart. It knew that 12 golden warriors with sun lances were a problem, but a single clanking human with a limp? That was a snack. Great, I muttered, pulling my first acoustic mine from my bag. I'm the bait, again. I didn't head into the forest. I headed for a narrow canyon of jagged obsidian to my left. It was a bottleneck, a place where speed meant nothing and positioning meant everything. As I walked, I started dropping my needles. I placed the first acoustic mine at the entrance of the canyon, burying it under the silver sand. I set the trigger for a thermal signature over 30 degrees Celsius, anything with a Corinthian or B-size metabolism. 200 meters further in, I set a microfilament wire across the path. The wire was coated in a caustic crystalline dust I'd raided from the labs. It wouldn't stop a beast, but it would mark it. It would turn an invisible predator into a glowing target. By the time I reached the back of the canyon, my breath was coming in ragged gasps. The kinetic braces were doing the heavy lifting, but the constant vibration was starting to set my nerves on fire. My rheumatism was roaring now, a deep, grinding fire in my hips that felt like someone was trying to peel the muscles off the bone. I found a small alcove and sat down, leaning my back against the cold, unyielding stone. I pulled a small injector from my belt, a cocktail of Terran stimulants and a Corinthian nerve blocker I'd brewed in the lab. It was a dangerous mix, the kind of stuff that could stop your heart if you weren't careful. But I needed the edge. I slammed the injector into my thigh. A wave of cold, synthetic numbness washed over me, followed by a jolt of artificial energy that made my vision sharpen. The pain didn't go away. It never did. But it retreated to a dull, manageable roar. I waited. For an hour, the only sound was the chiming of the glass leaves and the distant, muffled booms of sun lances as the nobles chased shadows in the forest. They were wasting their energy, hunting a beast that wasn't there. Then my visor pinged. A heat signature was approaching the canyon entrance. It was fast. It was moving in a jagged, erratic pattern that bypassed the natural lines of the forest. It was a predator that knew how to hide in the noise. The thermal signature hit the first mine. There was no explosion. Instead, a high-frequency pulse rippled through the air, a sound so sharp it made the obsidian walls of the canyon weep dust. The invisible void in my visor suddenly flared. The beast wasn't invisible anymore. The acoustic pulse had caused its crystalline skin to vibrate at a frequency that made it glow like a neon sign. It was a nightmare of geometry, a creature the size of a Terran grizzly, but made of jagged, interlocking shards of black glass. It had 6 legs that ended in needle-sharp points and a head that was nothing but a mass of sensory feelers. It let out a sound like 1,000 violins being smashed, a screech of pure, resonant agony. "Gotcha," I whispered. The beast recovered in seconds. It smelled my fear, or maybe it just sensed the heat of my suit. It lunged into the canyon, its 6 legs clicking against the stone like a hail of bullets. It hit the second trap. The microfilament wire snapped, showering the creature in caustic dust. The dust reacted with the beast's internal energy, bursting into a brilliant, emerald green flame. Now, it wasn't just a glowing void. It was a screaming, green torch. It was 50 meters away, 40, 30. I stood up, the kinetic braces whirring as they locked my legs into a firing stance. I pulled the acoustic pistol and aimed. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the tremors that had been my constant companion for a decade. My knuckles were swollen, and the grip of the pistol felt like a hot iron in my palm. "Come on, Elias," I hissed through gritted teeth. "Just one shot." The beast leaped. It was a blur of emerald flame and black glass, its claws extended to rip the life out of the fragile thing in its path. I didn't fire at the beast. I fired at the ceiling. The acoustic round hit a cluster of unstable quartz formations directly above the creature. The frequency was perfect. The quartz didn't just break, it detonated. Tons of jagged glass rained down on the predator, burying it under a mountain of amethyst shards. The green flame flickered and died as the creature was pinned to the floor of the canyon. The silence that followed was deafening. I stepped forward, my boots crunching on the broken glass. The beast was still alive, its 6 legs twitching feebly under the weight of the rubble. In the center of its chest, a pulsing violet core was visible, the prize the nobles were killing each other to find. I could have taken it. I could have ended the hunt right then and there. I could have walked out of that canyon with the prize and rubbed it in Lord Kalen's face. But my visor pinged again. 3 heat signatures were approaching. Golden streaks. The nobles. They hadn't heard the beast, but they had heard my acoustic rounds, and they weren't coming to congratulate me. I looked at the beast, then at the entrance of the canyon. I didn't take the core. Instead, I pulled 2 more mines from my bag and set them near the beast's head. I set the trigger for a specific Corinthian energy signature, the gold light of a sun lance. Then I hobbled back into the shadows of my alcove and turned off my suit's external lights. Minutes later, Lord Kalen and 2 of his cronies glided into the canyon. They looked immaculate, their armor unscratched, their faces filled with a mix of confusion and rage. "Where is the human?" Kalen demanded, his sun lance held at the ready. I heard the resonance of his primitive weapons. He stopped when he saw the pile of rubble and the twitching, emerald-stained leg of the beast. His eyes flared a brilliant, covetous gold. "The Vex Predator!" He laughed, a sound like cracking ice. The fool killed it and died in the collapse, a fitting end for a broken creature. He stepped forward, his sun lance glowing as he prepared to extract the core. The blade of the lance touched the surface of the rubble. The mines I'd set didn't pulse. They screamed. The frequency hit the sun lances, causing the golden energy to feed back into the handles. Kalen and his companions were thrown back by a massive discharge of static electricity. Their armor flickered, their skin turning a shocked, painful gray. I stepped out of the shadows, my acoustic pistol leveled at Kalen's head. The kinetic braces whirred, making me look taller, more stable than I actually was. "Careful, Lord Kalen," I said, my voice cold and hard. "That quartz is very unstable. One more spark from your lance and this whole canyon becomes a tomb, and I don't think your perfect body can handle 5 tons of falling amethyst." Kalen looked up at me, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. You used the beast as bait? You attacked a noble of the spire?" "I didn't attack you," I said, walking toward him. "I just set a safety precaution. You were the one who touched it without asking. Now here's how this is going to work." I knelt down, the movement sending a white-hot spike of pain through my hip that nearly made me black out. I gritted my teeth, refusing to show it. I reached into the rubble and pulled out the violet core. It was warm, pulsing with a life force that felt like a steady heartbeat. "I'm taking the core," I said, "and you're going to walk back to the spire and tell everyone that the human survivor found the prize while you were busy looking for your reflection in a mirror." "I will kill you," Kalen hissed, his hand reaching for a hidden dagger. "Go ahead," I said, pressing the barrel of the acoustic pistol against his forehead. "But before you do, remember one thing. I've been living in pain for 10 years. I've survived 3 wars and a dozen surgeries. You've never even had a paper cut. Who do you think is more willing to pull the trigger?" Kalen froze. He looked into my eyes, and for the first time, he didn't see a primitive. He didn't see a broken thing. He saw a man who had made a home in the dark, a man who had turned his agony into a fortress. He slumped back, his skin turning a defeated muddy brown. I stood up, the core clutched in my hand. My body was screaming, every joint a localized disaster area, but I felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. I turned and walked out of the canyon, leaving the 3 silver gods in the dirt. The walk back to the spire was the longest 3 kilometers of my life. The nerve blockers were wearing off, and the pain was returning with a vengeance, a tidal wave of fire that threatened to drown me. I stumbled, I fell, I crawled, but I never let go of the core. When I finally reached the ridge where Vera was waiting, the sun was at its zenith. The golden light bathed the obsidian spire in a brilliance that was almost too much to bear. I collapsed at Vera's feet, the violet core rolling across the silver sand to stop at her boots. I couldn't stand. I couldn't speak. I could only lie there, my chest heaving, my breath a ragged whistle in the silence. Vera picked up the core. She looked at it, then at the bruised, clanking mess of a man at her feet. "The hunt is concluded," she announced, her voice echoing across the basin. "The shield consort has brought the prize. The vow remains." She knelt down beside me, her hand resting on my matted hair. Her touch was the only thing keeping me grounded, the only thing that felt real in a world made of glass. "You did it, Elias," she whispered. "You showed them fire." I managed a weak, blood-stained smile. "Next time," I said, the words barely a whisper. "Next time, let's just go to a bar." She laughed, a genuine, beautiful sound that was the best medicine I'd ever had. "I suppose we shall, my iron soul. I suppose we shall." As the medics approached with their floating stretchers, I felt the darkness closing in. But it wasn't a cold darkness. It was warm. It was the darkness of a man who had finally realized that his scars weren't a sign of failure. They were the evidence that he was still in the fight. And as I drifted off, I knew one thing for certain. I was broken. I was in pain. And I was the most dangerous man in the Carithian Empire. The recovery tank didn't smell like a hospital. It smelled like rain on hot pavement. I floated in a suspension of cyan-colored gel that felt like being hugged by a lukewarm jellyfish. It was supposed to be the pinnacle of Carithian medical science, bioluminescent enzymes that mapped your DNA and knitted tissues back together before you could even register a bruise. But for me, it was just another fancy way to feel miserable. Carithian tech was designed for Carithian bodies. Their cells were orderly, disciplined, almost architectural. My cells were a riot. My immune system saw the healing enzymes as a hostile invasion and went to war. Instead of a soothing soak, the last 6 hours had been a slow-motion car crash inside my skin. "Status check, Elias," I rasped, my voice muffled by the breathing mask. "Right knee feels like it was put through a wood chipper. Left shoulder, throbbing in 3/4 time. Ego, bruised but currently operational. The gel drained with a soft, wet hiss. The tank's transparent walls dissolved, and I tumbled out onto a floor that felt far too hard and far too cold. I didn't fall, though. A pair of strong, silver hands caught me by the armpits and hauled me upright with the casual strength of a hydraulic press. "You are remarkably inefficient at healing," Vera said. Her voice was a low vibration that rattled around in my chest. "It's a talent," I said, blinking the cyan gunk out of my eyes. "We Terrans like to savor our injuries. Makes us feel like we're getting our money's worth." She didn't let go until she was sure I wouldn't collapse. She was back in her Strategos regalia, mercury weave armor that flowed over her shoulders like liquid silk, glowing with a soft, authoritative gold. Beside her, a medical droid that looked like a floating cluster of glass needles hovered impatiently. "The council is in an uproar, Elias," she said, her copper eyes fixed on mine. "Lord Kalen claims you used prohibited acoustic weaponry to sabotage the hunt. He says you stole the core of the Vex Predator through trickery. Tell him I'm sorry I didn't play by the rules of the Silver Spoon Brigade," I muttered, accepting a towel from the droid. It was made of some hyper-absorbent fiber that felt like velvet. "I'll be sure to file a formal apology in the bin marked Nobody Cares." "Did he mention the part where I saved his shiny hide from 5 tons of falling amethyst?" "He did not," Vera replied, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "But the core you brought is undeniable. You are the winner of the trial by Carithian law. However, Kalen is old nobility. He has friends in the High Senate who believe that a human shield consort is a stain on our heritage. They want to see you fail. They're going to have to stand in line," I said, gingerly testing my weight on my right leg. The kinetic assist braces were gone, replaced by a temporary medical wrap that hummed with a low-frequency pulse. It didn't stop the grinding ache, but it took the edge off. "I feel like 100 marks of bad debt, Vera." "What's the sit rep?" "The sit rep?" She tilted her head, a gesture of curiosity she had picked up from me. "Military slang. Situation report. Give me the tactical rundown before I pass out again." "The rundown is this. We are leaving the Spire, at least for a few days. The political climate here is toxic, and I have a border inspection that cannot be delayed. I want you to see the rest of the hegemony, Elias. I want you to see what perfection looks like when it reaches the edge of the galaxy. I looked at her, really looked at her. Her skin was flawless, her posture perfect, her power absolute, but there was a shadow in her eyes. The kind of shadow you only see in people who have spent too long looking at a beautiful lie. Fine by me, I said. I've always wanted to see the suburbs of a crystalline empire. Just let me grab my boots and my painkillers. It's going to be a long trip. 3 hours later, we were on board the Argent Wing, a Corithian scout ship that looked like a shard of polished bone. It didn't use engines in the traditional sense. It manipulated gravity wells, sliding through space with a silent, stomach-churning grace. I sat in the observation lounge watching the stars blur into streaks of chromatic light. My body was in a state of quiet rebellion. The stress of the hunt, followed by the failed healing tank, had pushed my rheumatism into a new, exciting territory of agony. Every breath felt like my ribcage was being tightened by a vice. "You are hiding it again," Vera said. She was standing at the viewport, her back to me. "Hiding what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from trembling. "The fire in your bones. I can hear the way your heart rate spikes when you move. I can see the tension in your jaw. Why do you refuse the nerve blockers?" "Because those blockers make my head feel like it's stuffed with cotton wool, Vera," I snapped, more sharply than I intended. "If I'm going to be your shield consort, I need to be sharp. I can't protect you if I'm floating in a drug-induced haze. I've lived with this for 12 years. I know how to manage the burn." She turned around, her expression unreadable. 12 years of constant battle. "And your people call this normal?" "No," I said, leaning my head back against the cold glass of the seat. "My people call it chronic. It means it's always there. It's the background noise of my life. You ever have a ringing in your ears that you just eventually stop noticing? It's like that, except the ringing is made of broken glass and fire." She walked over and sat across from me. For a high strategos, she was remarkably good at being still. It was a predatory stillness, the kind that made you realize she was always calculating, always observing. "We are heading to the Shattered Rim," she said. "It is a cluster of mining colonies on the edge of the Scorched Divide. It is where we extract the raw crystals for our cities. It is also where we send the Cracked." "The Cracked?" I raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like a bad indie band. It is our term for those Corithians who are no longer perfect. Those whose healing cycles have failed, or who were born with genetic drifts that our labs could not correct. In the Spire, we pretend they do not exist. On the Rim, they are the labor force." "Wait a second," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "You have a whole colony of outcasts? I thought your people didn't do defects." "We don't," she said, her voice turning brittle. "We hide them. We ship them to the Rim and tell the public they are volunteers for the frontier. It is the great shame of the Corithian hegemony. We worship the unscarred, Elias. To be scarred is to be forgotten." I felt a cold knot of anger tighten in my gut. It was a familiar feeling, the same anger I'd felt when the Earth Defense Coalition tried to give me a medical discharge and a pat on the back after I'd taken shrapnel for them. The world hates a broken tool. "So I'm a special guest at a leper colony," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Terrific. I'll be sure to bring my I'm with stupid t-shirt." "You are not a guest," she said, leaning forward. "You are a mirror. I want the Cracked to see you, and I want you to see them. I want to know if your iron soul is something that can be taught." I didn't have an answer for that. I just looked out at the stars and wondered how many more ways this empire could find to break my heart. We reached the Rim colony of Orin 5 2 days later. It wasn't a city of light and crystal. It was a jagged gray rock floating in a nebula of toxic gas. The buildings were made of dull, reinforced carbon, scarred by industrial lasers and the harsh environment. There was no music here, only the constant grinding hum of the atmospheric processors. As we stepped off the shuttle, I saw them, the Cracked. They were Corithians, but they weren't the silver gods I'd seen in the Spire. One woman had a limb made of dull, non-reactive metal, a primitive prosthetic that looked like it belonged in a history museum. Another man had skin that was mottled with gray patches of necrosis, his eyes dim and clouded. They moved with a slow, heavy gait that I recognized instantly. It was the walk of people who were intimately acquainted with pain. The guards at the landing pad, perfect golden warriors, pushed the workers aside to make a path for Vera. They didn't use violence, but the way they moved, the sheer contempt in their eyes was worse than a blow. It was the way you'd move a pile of trash out of your way. Vera walked with her head held high, her gold armor reflecting the dull gray light of the colony. I followed behind her, my kinetic braces whirring, my face a mask of neutral exhaustion. One of the workers, an old Corinthian with a missing eye and a hunched back, tripped and fell into our path. He scrambled to get out of the way, his hands scraping against the jagged rock. A guard stepped forward, his energy pike humming. "Move, defect!" the guard snarled. "You obstruct the high strategos." The old man looked up, terror in his single silver eye. "I'm sorry, my leg. It wouldn't move." The guard raised the butt of his pike. He wasn't going to kill him, but he was going to correct him. "Stow it, soldier," I barked. The guard froze, turning to look at me. The Corinthian workers went silent, their eyes widening. A human dressed in Corinthian gear, speaking with the authority of a commander? It was like seeing a dog start reciting Shakespeare. "The shield consort spoke," Vera said, her voice like a whip. "Lower your weapon." The guard hesitated, then stepped back, his skin turning a confused gray. I stepped forward and knelt down beside the old man. My knee gave a loud, agonizing crack that echoed in the silence. I ignored it. I reached out and took the old man's hand. His skin was rough, cold, and dry, nothing like the smooth, warm silver of the nobles. "Take it easy, Pop," I said, using the gentlest version of my sergeant voice. "You're not in any trouble. Just take a breath." He stared at me, his lip trembling. You have the marks," he whispered, pointing at the scars on my neck that peaked above my collar. "You are broken too." "I'm a regular disaster area," I said with a small smile. "But I'm still standing. Can you get up?" I think so." I put his arm over my shoulder and signaled to the kinetic braces. I dialed the power up to 60%. The suit hissed, the motors whining as they took the combined weight of both of us. We stood up together, a broken human and a discarded alien, leaning on each other in the dirt of a dead rock. The silence on the landing pad was absolute. The workers were staring. The guards were horrified. Vera was watching me with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. I led the old man to a nearby bench and sat him down. "Stay off that leg for a bit," I said, "and tell your friends to stop hiding. I'm not here to judge the scars. I've got enough of my own to fill a book." The old man grabbed my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Why?" he asked. "Why do you help a cracked thing?" "Because there's no such thing as a cracked soul," I said, looking him in the eye. "Only cracked bodies, and those can be reinforced." I turned back to Vera. She was standing 10 feet away, her gold armor shimmering. The contrast between her and the workers was blinding, but for the first time, she looked uncomfortable. "Is this what you wanted me to see, Vera?" I asked, my voice carrying across the pad. "You wanted to see if I could teach them? Well, here's your first lesson. You don't teach strength to people who have been surviving in this hellhole for decades. You just remind them that they aren't the only ones who hurt." Vera didn't say anything for a long time. She looked at the workers, then at the guards, and finally at me. Her skin flickered a deep, bruised violet, the color of a truth that hurt to acknowledge. "We moved to the command center," she said finally. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor in the underlying resonance. The next 3 days were a blur of inspections and meetings. Vera was professional, efficient, and cold. She demanded reports on production quotas, atmospheric stability, and defensive readiness. But I could tell she was distracted. She kept looking out the windows at the workers. She kept watching me as I moved among them, sharing my meager rations and telling stories of Earth. Stories of people who lived whole, messy lives without a single day of perfection. I was sitting in the colony's small med bay on the third night, trying to repair a faulty sensor on my visor, when the door opened. It was a Corinthian woman named Alara. She was young, maybe the equivalent of a human 20-year-old. But her left arm was a withered, crystalline stump that pulsed with a sickly yellow light. "The strategos said you might have tools," she said, her voice barely a whisper. My arm. It burns. The healers say there is nothing to be done. I looked at her arm. It was a classic case of resonance rejection. Her body was trying to grow the limb back, but the genetic instructions were corrupted, leading to a constant cycle of growth and shattering. I don't have Corinthian medicine, Alara, I said softly. I'm just a guy with some wire and a lot of stubbornness. She sat down across from me, her eyes filled with a desperate, hollow hope. Please, anything is better than the burn. I spent the next 4 hours working on her. I didn't use light beams or DNA spinners. I used a high-density polymer sleeve I'd salvaged from the trash and a set of micro-dampeners from my own rucksack. I built her a pressure cuff that would vibrate at a frequency opposite to her arm's resonance, canceling out the pain. It was crude. It was ugly. It was human. When I slid the cuff onto her stump and activated it, she let out a long, shuddering breath. Her skin turned a soft, peaceful blue. It stopped, she whispered, tears of silver fluid welling in her eyes. The fire, it's gone. It's just a dampener, I cautioned. You'll have to calibrate it every few days. But it'll give you some peace. She looked at the ugly black polymer cuff on her arm. It is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. I watched her walk out of the med bay, her posture straighter, her head held higher. I felt a small, rare spark of pride in my chest. But as I turned back to my visor, a shadow fell across the table. You are a dangerous man, Elias Thorne, Vera said. She was standing in the doorway, her armor dark in the dim light. Dangerous? I asked, giving her a tired look. I'm a guy who just helped a girl with a sore arm. No, she said, stepping into the room. You are giving them hope. You are showing them that they don't need the spire's perfection to be whole. You are undermining the very foundation of my culture. Is that a threat, Strategos? She walked over and sat down beside me. Her skin was a chaotic swirl of colors, gold, violet, gray. She looked like she was fighting a war inside her own mind. It is an observation, she said. My people have lived by the law of the unscarred for 10,000 years. We believe that pain was a sign of failure. But I look at you, and I look at Alara, and I see something else. I see a strength that isn't dependent on being whole. She reached out and touched the kinetic brace on my leg. This is not perfection, she said. This is resistance. Resistance is all we've got, Vera, I said. We break. We hurt. We keep going anyway. That's the human condition. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked me in the eye. I have received a message from the Spire. The High Council has called for an emergency session. They have evidence of a conspiracy, Elias, and they say it involves your people. My people? I frowned. The Terran Union? We're just trying to open trade routes. What could we possibly be conspiring about? They claim that the Terran Diplomatic Corps has been funneling weapons and technology to the Cracked. They say you are not a shield consort, but an infiltrator, a catalyst for a revolution. I stared at her, the blood draining from my face. That's insane. I'm a grunt. I don't know anything about revolutions. I was sent here to stand at attention and look professional. I believe you, she said, her voice low. But Kalen has presented data logs. He has records of secret meetings between your ambassador and the leaders of the Rim colonies. The knot in my gut turned into a block of ice. I thought about Ambassador Miller, a career politician with a smile as fake as a 3-mark bill. I thought about the way he'd looked at me when I accepted the vow. He hadn't been worried. He'd been pleased. I'm being played, I whispered. We're both being played. Vera stood up, her armor flaring a warning gold. We returned to the Spire at dawn. If this conspiracy is real, the Council will execute you before the sun sets, and they will strip me of my command for bringing you into our house. Then we don't go back to the Spire, I said, standing up. The kinetic braces whirred, protesting the sudden movement. We stay here. We find out the truth. We cannot stay, she said, her eyes turning obsidian. To stay is to admit guilt. We must face them. But know this, Elias Thorne, if my people move against you, I will not stand aside. I bound my honor to yours. And unlike the Council, I do not break my word. I looked at her, this alien warrior who was willing to throw away an empire for a broken human she'd known for 3 weeks. I felt a surge of something. Not love, not yet, but a deep, profound loyalty that made my own pain seem insignificant. Then let's go give them hell, I said, reaching for my rucksack. I've always wanted to see a Corinthian trial. I hear the food is terrible. Vera didn't laugh, but she gripped my shoulder with a strength that told me everything I needed to know. The hunt was over. The war was just beginning. The return to the obsidian spire felt like walking into a funeral, specifically my own. The city was as beautiful as ever, the living crystal pulsing with a rhythmic, ethereal light. But the colors were wrong. Instead of the vibrant golds and blues of a thriving capital, the walls were a stagnant, sickly yellow. It was the color of suspicion, the color of a world holding its breath before the first drop of blood hits the floor. As we stepped off the Argent Wing, we weren't met by a welcoming committee. We were met by 2 full battalions of the Praetorian Guard. Their armor was black chrome, their energy shields already humming at half power. "High Strategos Vera," the lead officer said, his voice echoing through the docking bay. His skin was a rigid, unmoving gray. "By order of the High Senate, your guest is to be taken into custody. You are to report to the Central Spire for immediate debriefing." I felt Vera's hand move toward the hilt of her gravity blade. The air around her began to shimmer with heat. "On what grounds?" she demanded, her voice like a rolling thunderstorm. "Treason, sedition." "Violation of the purity codes," the officer replied, "and the shield consort is suspected of being a biological hazard, a carrier of Terran pathogens intended to destabilize the Corinthian genome." I almost laughed. "A biological hazard? I'm a human with a bad hip, not a walking plague," I muttered, though the sight of 100 energy pikes pointed at my chest made my sarcasm feel a bit thin. "This is a bit much for a guy who just wants a nap and some ibuprofen, don't you think?" "Silence, primitive," the officer snapped. Vera stepped in front of me, her armor flaring a brilliant, blinding white. "If you want him, you will have to walk through me, Commander. He is my shield consort. Under the law of the shards, he is an extension of my own soul. To arrest him is to arrest me." The Praetorians hesitated. Even they weren't eager to trade blows with the most decorated military commander in their history. The tension in the bay was a physical pressure, a localized storm of ego and energy. Then a familiar voice cut through the static. Now, let's not have a diplomatic incident before breakfast, shall we?" I turned my head. Walking toward us, flanked by his own security detail of Terran Marines, was Ambassador Miller. He looked perfectly at home in the alien environment, his 3-piece suit immaculately pressed, his smile as sharp and hollow as ever. "Ambassador," I said, my voice tight, "you want to tell me what's going on? Because it feels a lot like I'm being fitted for a coffin." "Sergeant Moss, or should I call you Shield Consort now?" Miller said, stopping a safe distance away. "I'm afraid there's been a bit of a misunderstanding. Some unfortunate data has come to light regarding your activities on the rim." "You mean the data Kalen faked?" I asked. Miller's smile didn't waver, but his eyes were as cold as deep space. "The Corinthians are very sensitive about their cracked citizens, Sergeant. They don't take kindly to outsiders stirring up trouble in their labor camps. They've provided some very compelling evidence that you were acting as a courier for certain revolutionary elements." I looked at the Marines behind him. They were looking at the floor, their faces stony. They knew. They all knew. I wasn't an attaché. I was a sacrificial lamb. A way for Earth to gain leverage or to distract the Corinthians while something else was happening in the background. "You set me up," I whispered. "You sent me here knowing this would happen." Miller adjusted his cufflinks. "Earth needs the Corinthian trade routes, Elias. We need their technology. Sometimes that requires a bit of friction, a common enemy to bring 2 sides together. If the Corinthians execute a rogue Terran soldier for treason, it proves our commitment to their laws. It builds trust." "You're a real piece of work, Miller," I said, my hand instinctively moving toward the hilt of the acoustic pistol at my hip. "I ought to—" A Corinthian guard stepped forward and slammed the butt of his pike into the back of my knees. The kinetic assist suit took most of the blow, but the impact sent a shockwave of agony through my lower spine. I went down hard, the breath leaving my lungs in a ragged wheeze. Elias, Vera screamed. She drew her blade. The sound was a high-pitched whistle of displaced air. The Praetorians raised their pikes. The Terran Marines gripped their rifles. Stop, I gasped, holding up a hand. Vera, don't. If you fight them now, they'll use it as proof. They'll take everything from you. She looked down at me, her eyes a swirling vortex of copper and black. Her skin was a terrifying, jagged orange, pure, unadulterated rage. I will burn this city to the ground before I let them take you, Elias. I know, I said, struggling to get a breath. And that's exactly what they want. They want you out of the way. Kalen wants your seat. Miller wants a Corithian leader he can manipulate. If you fight, they win. She stood there, her blade humming, her whole body vibrating with the effort to restrain herself. Slowly, agonizingly, she lowered the weapon. The glow of her armor dimmed to a bruised, somber violet. Take him, she said, her voice a hollow rasp. But know this, if a single mark is added to his body that was not there before, I will find every person involved in this conspiracy, and I will show them what it truly means to be a warrior of the hegemony. The guards didn't waste any time. They hauled me to my feet and dragged me toward a waiting transport. My legs were useless, trailing behind me like dead weight. I looked back at Vera. She was standing in the center of the docking bay, surrounded by enemies and traitors, looking more alone than I'd ever seen her. The prison of the Obsidian Spire was located at the very base of the city, carved into the bedrock of the planet itself. It was a place of silence and shadow, where the walls didn't pulse with light, but seemed to suck the warmth out of the air. They stripped me of my combat suit, my visor, and my rucksack. They left me in my basic Terran undershirt and trousers, sitting on a slab of cold gray stone. Without the kinetic braces, the weight of my own body felt like a crushing burden. The pain, which had been a dull roar for the last few days, returned with the force of a hurricane. I curled into a ball on the floor, my teeth chattering, my joints feeling like they were filled with molten lead. Is this it? I whispered to the dark. After all that, I'd die in a hole because of a politician's smile? Hours passed, or maybe it was days. In the dark, time lost its meaning. My fever climbed, a result of the stress and the flare-up in my immune system. I hallucinated. I saw Kepler 442b. I saw the shrapnel tearing through my shoulder. I saw the faces of the men I couldn't save. Then the door to my cell dissolved. I expected a guard. I expected Kalen with a sun lance and a sneer. Instead, I saw a small, hunched figure, an old Corithian with a missing eye. You, I croaked, trying to sit up. The old man from the landing pad. What are you doing here? The cracked have many paths through the spire, human, he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp. We are the cleaners, the maintenance crews, the ones nobody looks at. He shuffled into the cell and knelt beside me. He held a small vial of blue liquid to my lips. Drink. It is not Corithian medicine. It is the root extract of the Whispering Wilds. It will numb the fire. I drank it. It tasted like bitter earth and ozone, but within seconds, a cool numbness began to spread through my limbs. It wasn't the chemical haze of the nerve blockers. It was a deep, natural silence. The High Strategos is under house arrest, the old man said. They are stripping her of her fleet. They say she has been corrupted by the human rot. I felt a fresh wave of guilt. I did this. I ruined her. No, the old man said, his single silver eye shining in the dark. You changed her, and she is changing us. Look. He pulled back the sleeve of his rough tunic. On his arm was the black polymer cuff I had built for Alara. It was scratched, dented, and clearly a replica. But it was there. She shared the design, he said. The cracked are building them in secret. For the first time in 10,000 years, we have a way to stand without pain. We have a way to work without fear. You gave us a tool, Elias Thorne. But more than that, you gave us a reason to fight. I looked at the crude black cuff. It was a piece of garbage in a city of light, but it was the most important thing I'd ever made. What do I do? I asked. I'm trapped in a hole. I can't even walk. The old man smiled, showing a row of jagged, crystalline teeth. You don't need to walk, Iron Soul. You just need to survive long enough for the fire to spread. The High Council thinks they have removed the infection. They do not realize that the infection is the cure. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small metallic object. It was a communicator, a Terran model, battered and old. The Stratego says to tell you, the hunt is not over. The prey has simply changed. He pressed the communicator into my hand. Now hide. The guards return soon. Remember, Elias Thorne, a broken blade can still find the heart if it is sharp enough. He shuffled out of the cell, the door reforming behind him. I sat in the dark, the blue liquid cooling the fire in my veins, the small Terran communicator, a heavy, hopeful weight in my palm. I wasn't a jester. I wasn't an attaché. I wasn't a sacrificial lamb. I was a sergeant of the Earth Defense Coalition, and I had a war to win. I leaned back against the cold stone, a dry, sardonic laugh bubbling up in my throat. My rheumatism was still there, a ghost in the machine, but for the first time in years, it wasn't the only thing defining me. Okay, Kalen. Okay, Miller, I whispered. You want a revolution? I'll give you one, but fair warning, it's going to be messy, and I'm really, really bad at following the rules. I closed my eyes and started to count my heartbeats, but I wasn't counting to keep from fainting. I was counting down to 0 hour. The spire was beautiful, but it was built on a foundation of lies, and I was the crack in the glass that was going to bring the whole thing down. The blue root extract was a liar, but it was a kind one. For the first time in what felt like 100 years, the fire in my marrow had settled into a cool, subterranean hum. I sat in the darkness of my cell, the small Terran communicator tucked into the waistband of my trousers like a stolen secret. The silence of the lower spire was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against my eardrums, broken only by the occasional, distant thrum of the city's life support systems. I was staring at the wall, trying to remember what it felt like to be whole. When the door dissolved, it wasn't the old man this time. The light that spilled into the cell was a harsh, artificial white, the kind of light that belongs in a laboratory or an interrogation room. Two figures stepped through the mist. One was a Corinthian guard in black chrome armor, his energy pike held at a lazy, arrogant angle. The other was Ambassador Miller. He looked out of place in the gloom, his expensive suit reflecting the dim light, his face arranged in a mask of practiced, professional sympathy. He gestured to the guard, who stepped back into the corridor, leaving us in a bubble of uneasy privacy. "Sergeant Moss," Miller said, his voice smooth and resonant, "you look terrible. Truly." I managed a dry, hacking cough that might have been a laugh. "Flattery will get you everywhere, Ambassador. I'm assuming you didn't come down to this basement to comment on my fashion choices. What's the play?" Miller walked into the center of the cell, looking at the cold stone walls with a faint expression of distaste. "The play, Elias, is that I am offering you a way out. A complete way out. Not just from this cell, but from the body that has been failing you for the last decade." I narrowed my eyes. The cool numbness of the root extract made my thoughts feel sharp, almost crystalline. "And what does that look like?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver canister. He pressed a button, and a holographic display flickered into life above his palm. It was a complex, swirling lattice of genetic code, pulsing with a vibrant, healthy green. "This is the Lazarus 7 protocol," Miller whispered. "It's the result of 10 years of covert research into Corinthian regenerative tech, adapted for human biology. We've been testing it on Luna Station. It doesn't just manage the symptoms, Elias. It rewrites the instructions. It will regrow the myelin sheaths on your nerves. It will lubricate the joints. It will flush the inflammation from your system as if it never existed." I stared at the green lattice. It was the Holy Grail. It was everything I had ever wanted since that afternoon on Kepler 442b when the world turned into a meat grinder. I could walk again. I could run. I could wake up in the morning and not have to spend 20 minutes convincing my legs to hold my weight. "And the catch?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Because there's always a catch with you, Miller." He closed the hologram and looked me in the eye. "The catch is simple. You testify. The High Senate is preparing a formal indictment against High Strategist Vera. They need a witness, someone close to her, who will testify that she initiated the contact with the Rim colonies, that she used you as a front to smuggle Terran weapons to the Cracked in order to build a private army and overthrow the Council. You want me to bury her, I said, the cold block of ice in my gut returning with a vengeance. I want you to be a hero, Elias, Miller corrected. A human soldier who discovered a plot to destabilize a friendly empire and had the courage to bring it to light. You'll be a poster boy for the Terran-Carithian alliance. You'll be the most famous man on Earth, and you'll have a body that works. You can go back to the service. You can be a field officer again. You can be what you were meant to be. I looked at my hands. They were steady now, thanks to the old man's root extract, but I could feel the ghost of the tremors waiting just beneath the surface. I thought about Vera. I thought about the way she had touched my scars. I thought about the way she had laughed when I told her I was too stubborn to die. She's a warrior, Miller, I said. She's the only person in this whole godforsaken empire who actually gives a damn about the truth. She's a liability, Elias, Miller snapped, the mask of sympathy slipping for a fraction of a second. She's too powerful, too popular, and too unpredictable. Earth needs stability. We need a Carithian government we can predict. Lord Kalen is a pragmatist. He understands the value of a mutually beneficial arrangement. Vera is a fanatic for honor, and honor doesn't pay the bills. I stood up, the movement slow and deliberate. The numbness made it easy, but I could feel the underlying weakness, the way my muscles were still thin and wiry from years of restricted movement. You're asking me to trade my soul for a new pair of knees, I said. I'm asking you to be smart, Miller replied. Look around you, Sergeant. You're in a hole. Your war husband is under guard. Your own people have already written you off as a rogue agent. This is the only life raft you're going to get. Take the protocol, sign the deposition, and you're on a shuttle to Luna by midnight. Or stay here and wait for Kalen to decide that a public execution is a good way to start his new administration. He stepped forward and placed the canister on the stone slab beside me. Think about it, Elias. Really think about it. You've spent 12 years being the broken man. Don't you think you've paid enough? He turned and walked toward the door. I'll be back in 2 hours. Have your answer ready. The door formed behind him, leaving me alone with the silver canister and the silence. I sat back down on the stone slab, my eyes fixed on the small metallic cylinder. It was so simple. One injection, and the pain would be gone. The shame would be gone. I would be the whole man again. I could go back to the world where everything made sense, where strength was measured in muscle and speed, and where I didn't have to explain why I was limping. But as I reached out to touch the canister, I saw the black polymer cuff on the old man's arm in my mind's eye. I saw the look on Alara's face when the fire in her arm stopped. I saw the thousands of cracked workers who were looking at me, not as a hero, but as one of them. If I took the cure, I wouldn't just be betraying Vera. I would be betraying the truth. I would be saying that they were right, that to be broken is to be worthless, that the only way to have value is to be perfect. I felt a sudden sharp pang in my chest, a pain that had nothing to do with rheumatism. It was the realization that my weakness wasn't a curse. It was a bridge. It was the thing that allowed me to see the world as it really was, not as the silver gods wanted it to be. The Carithians were perfect, and they were dying of stagnation. They were so afraid of a scar that they had forgotten how to live. And here was Miller, offering me that same stagnant perfection. I picked up the canister. It was heavy, cold, and felt like a lead weight in my hand. Is this who I am? I whispered. A man who trades his friends for a better set of nerves? I thought about the training I'd done with Vera. I thought about the way I'd taught her to fight dirty, to use her surroundings, to assume that everything would fail. That was the human way. We didn't succeed because we were perfect. We succeeded because we knew how to fail better than anyone else. I looked at the communicator in my hand. It was an old piece of junk, a relic of a military that had already discarded me. But it worked. I didn't open the canister. I didn't sign the deposition. I threw the Lazarus 7 protocol against the far wall of the cell. The silver casing shattered, and the glowing green fluid spilled across the cold stone, sizzling and smoking as it reacted with the stagnant air. It looked like the blood of a dying god. I picked up the communicator and pressed the primary transmission key. This is Sergeant Elias Thorne, I said, my voice steady and clear. To any cracked units listening on the subnet, The hunt has changed. Oscar Mike in 30 minutes. If you want to show the spire what a broken soul can do, now's the time to punch in. I sat back against the wall, the cool numbness of the root extract beginning to fade. The fire was coming back, a slow, familiar heat in my hips and my spine. I welcomed it. It was my compass. It was the reminder that I was still alive, still real, and still very, very angry. 2 hours later, the door dissolved again. Miller stepped in, a smug smile on his face. "I assume you've made the right choice, Elias?" I looked up at him, the sweat already beginning to beat on my forehead as the pain returned. "I've made a choice, Ambassador, but I don't think you're going to like it." He looked at the shattered canister on the floor, the green fluid now a dull, inert puddle. His face turned a shade of red that I'd never seen before, the color of a man who had just realized he'd lost his leverage. "You fool," he hissed. "You've just signed your death warrant. Do you have any idea what they'll do to you?" "Probably something unpleasant involving crystals and resonance," I said, managing a genuine, jagged smile. "But here's the thing, Miller. You can fix a nerve, you can fix a joint, but you can't fix a coward. And I'd rather be a broken man with a soul than a perfect man who's nothing but a puppet for a guy like you." Miller turned to the guard, his eyes filled with a murderous light. "Kill him. Do it now. Make it look like a suicide." The guard stepped forward, his energy pike humming, the tip glowing with a lethal, violet energy. He raised the weapon, his eyes cold and indifferent. I didn't move. I didn't have to. Suddenly, the ceiling of the cell erupted. A shower of crystalline dust and black polymer rained down on us. 4 figures dropped from the shadows, cracked workers dressed in rough tunics but armed with modified industrial lasers and heavy kinetic wrenches. They moved with a jerky, uncoordinated grace, their black polymer cuffs humming with a defiant, protective power. Elara was in the lead, her withered arm reinforced by the pressure sleeve I had built for her. She didn't look like a defect anymore. She looked like a Valkyrie. "Hands off the iron soul," she snarled, leveling her laser at the guard's head. The guard froze. Miller scrambled back into the corner, his eyes wide with terror. "Sergeant," Elara said, turning to me, "the spire is awake. The Strategos has broken her arrest. The cracked are in the streets. It's time to go." I reached out and she pulled me to my feet. The pain in my knee was a sharp, biting reminder of reality, but I didn't care. I leaned on her, and together we walked out of the cell. I looked back at Miller, who was trembling in the corner, his expensive suit covered in dust. "Hey, Ambassador," I called out. He looked up, his face pale and sweating. "Keep the change," I said. "I'm going to go find a more honest line of work." We ran into the corridor, the sound of boots and whirring motors echoing through the lower levels of the spire. The fire was roaring now, a conflagration in my bones. But I didn't try to hide it. I used it. I let the pain drive me. Let it turn my movements into a jagged, unpredictable dance of survival. The hunt was on, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the prey. The obsidian spire was screaming. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears. It was a vibration you felt in your teeth, a discordant, clashing melody that rippled through the living crystal of the city. The walls were a chaotic mosaic of colors, angry reds, panicked oranges, and the deep, bruised indigo of a society in shock. The revolution didn't look like a human war. There were no artillery barrages, no tanks rumbling through the streets. It was a war of frequencies. The cracked had seized the atmospheric processors and the power grids. They weren't using them to blow things up. They were using them to change the resonance of the city. They were broadcasting the noise of their own pain, the irregular, jagged frequencies of their broken bodies into the perfect, crystalline harmony of the spire. To the Kurithian nobles, it was like being forced to listen to 1,000 screaming violins while standing in a room full of strobe lights. It didn't kill them, but it shattered their focus, destabilized their gravity tech, and made their perfect silver skin crawl with a visceral, sickening discomfort. I stood on the bridge of a maintenance skiff, leaning heavily against a console as we soared toward the Hall of Iridescence. Elara was at the controls, her polymer-reinforced arm steady as she navigated the chaotic air traffic of the city. Around us, dozens of other skiffs, piloted by the cracked, were swarming like angry hornets around the central towers. "How's the leg, Sergeant?" Ilara asked, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. "It's currently trying to file for a divorce from the rest of my body," I said, gritting my teeth as a particularly sharp jolt went through the skiff. "But I think we'll make it to the ceremony. Are the others in position?" "The old man, Oren, has the southern gates," she said. "He says the Praetorian Guard is having a hard time staying on their feet. The resonance is too much for them. They've never had to deal with imperfection on this scale. It's a real shit show for them, isn't it?" I muttered, checking the charge on my acoustic pistol. They spent 10,000 years trying to build a world without noise, and now the noise is the only thing they can hear. We approached the Hall of Iridescence, the massive crystal dome now glowing with a sickly, flickering yellow light. A battalion of Praetorian guards was stationed on the landing platform, their energy shields flickering as they struggled to maintain their formation in the discordant atmosphere. As we landed, the guards tried to raise their pikes, but their movements were slow, sluggish, like they were moving through waist-deep water. I stepped off the skiff, the kinetic assist suit, which Oren's team had recovered and repaired, whirring into life as it locked onto my frame. It wasn't as smooth as the first time, but it was sturdier, reinforced with scavenged parts from the mining colony. It felt like being held together by a group of very angry, very determined ghosts. "Elias!" I turned. High Strategos Vera was standing at the entrance of the hall, her liquid mercury armor scarred and dull, her copper eyes blazing with a fierce, desperate light. She was leading a small group of officers who had remained loyal to her, men and women whose own skin was showing the first signs of stress and decay. "You're late for the party," she said, her voice a low rumble that cut through the city's scream. "Traffic was a nightmare," I said, limping toward her. "I brought some friends. I hope you don't mind." She looked at the swarm of cracked skiffs behind me, then at the workers who were stepping onto the platform, their crude weapons held with a grim, practiced determination. "The law of the unscarred is dead," she said, her voice carrying across the platform. "My people are finally waking up to the reality of the void. But Kalen is inside. He has the High Senate under guard. He's planning to invoke the final protocol, a total resonance reset. It will stabilize the city, but it will incinerate every biological life form that isn't perfectly attuned to the spire's frequency." "He's going to purge the cracked," I whispered. "He's going to purge anyone who isn't perfect," Vera corrected, "including me, and including you." "Then we'd better go stop him," I said, leveling my pistol. "I'm not really in the mood for a tan today." We entered the Hall of Iridescence. It was a scene of magnificent, terrifying chaos. The High Senate, 50 of the oldest, most powerful nobles in the empire, were huddled in the center of the chamber, their skin a pale, terrified gray. Lord Kalen stood on the central dais, his hands glowing with a blinding golden light as he interfaced with the city's primary crystal core. Ambassador Miller was there too, standing beside Kalen, his face a mask of sweating, desperate greed. He looked at us as we entered, his eyes wide with a frantic, cornered animal intensity. "Stop them!" Kalen roared, his voice amplified by the core. "They are the infection. They are the rot that will consume us all." The remaining Praetorians in the room surged forward, but Vera was a whirlwind of motion. She didn't use the elegant, fluid forms of the academy. She used the brutal, pragmatic tactics I taught her. She used her weight, she used the environment, and she fought with a ferocity that ignored the grace of the unscarred. I stayed back, using my acoustic pistol to shatter the gravity nodes the guards were trying to use for cover. Every shot I fired was a localized explosion of noise, a disruption that sent the nobles into fits of shivering agony. I was moving toward the dais when a familiar grinding pain flared in my right hip. It was a flare-up like I hadn't felt in years, a white-hot spike that bypassed the nerve blockers and the root extract and went straight for my sanity. I went down on one knee, the kinetic suit whining as it tried to compensate for my collapse. "Elias!" Vera shouted, but she was pinned down by 3 Praetorians. I looked up. Lord Kalen was staring at me, his face twisted into a sneer of pure, unadulterated contempt. Look at you, he hissed, his hands moving toward the final sequence on the core. A broken animal crawling in the dirt. You think you can change 10,000 years of history with a few primitive toys and a lot of noise? You are nothing but a malfunction in a world of perfection. I gritted my teeth, the sweat pouring down my face, my vision blurring with the intensity of the pain. I looked at the core, pulsing with that lethal golden light. I looked at the cracked workers who were fighting and dying in the doorway. And then I realized the truth. The Corinthians weren't perfect because they were strong. They were perfect because they were shielded. They lived in a world where everything was designed to protect them from the reality of existence. But I had lived in the reality of existence every single day of my life. The pain wasn't my weakness, it was my training. I reached into my rucksack and pulled out the last of my acoustic mines, but I didn't set it for a thermal signature or an energy pulse. I interfaced the mine with my own kinetic assist suit, specifically with the sensor array that tracked my own nerve impulses. "What are you doing?" Miller screamed from the dais. "I'm giving you a lesson in human biology, Ambassador," I rasped, my voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I activated the mine. The device began to broadcast the raw, unedited signal of my own chronic pain. It was a frequency of pure agony, a jagged, chaotic, and unrelenting resonance that captured every spike, every throb, and every grinding ache of my existence. The effect was instantaneous. The golden light of the core didn't just flicker, it buckled. The living crystal of the spire couldn't handle the intensity of the signal. It was too real, too raw, too human. The hall of iridescence began to vibrate with a frequency that felt like a physical scream. Lord Kalen screamed too. He was thrown back from the dais, his skin turning a sickly, mottled gray as his nervous system tried to process the tidal wave of pain I was broadcasting. The High Senate collapsed, their skin flickering through a dozen colors before settling into a terrified, dull charcoal. Ambassador Miller fell to his knees, his hands clutching his head, his eyes rolling back in his head. I was at the center of the storm. The pain in my hip was a part of the broadcast, a loop of agony that was now fueling the very weapon I was using to dismantle the spire. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. Every cell in my body was screaming for me to stop, to turn it off, to sink into the cool, dark silence of the void. But I didn't stop. I leaned into the fire. I used the pain like a scalpel, cutting through the golden lies of the Corinthian Empire. "Stop it!" Kalen wheezed, his skin cracking, silver fluid leaking from his pores. "Please, stop it." I stood up. I didn't use the suit. I didn't use the braces. I stood up on my own 2 feet, fueled by nothing but the raw, unyielding stubbornness of a man who had spent 12 years refusing to be diminished. I walked toward the dais, every step an act of war, every heartbeat a victory over the silence. I reached the core and looked at the glowing violet heart of the beast. I didn't destroy it. I just touched it. I pressed my palm against the crystal, letting the frequency of my scars, my pain, and my survival flow into the city's heart. The golden light changed. It didn't go out. It softened. The blinding, aggressive gold faded into a deep, resonant violet, the color of the whispering wilds. The scream of the city settled into a low, mournful hum, a sound that wasn't perfect, but was real. The Praetorians dropped their pikes. The nobles stopped screaming. The revolution didn't end with a bang. It ended with a breath. I collapsed onto the dais, the mind finally running out of power. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. Vera was there in an instant, her silver hands pulling me into her lap. She didn't say a word. She just held me, her skin turning a soft, glowing blue, the color of a piece that had been earned in the fire. "You did it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You broke the silence." I looked up at the crystal ceiling, where the violet light was now pulsing in time with my own jagged heartbeat. "I'm a sergeant," I croaked, managed a weak, exhausted smile. "Breaking things is part of the job description." I looked at the hall. The cracked were standing among the nobles. The workers were helping the senators to their feet. The guards were looking at their own hands as if seeing them for the first time. The law of the unscarred was gone, replaced by something new, something messy, and something profoundly human. I looked at Lord Kalen, who was slumped in the corner, his perfection shattered, his skin a roadmap of fine silver lines, the first scars he had ever earned. He looked terrified, but he also looked alive. And as for Ambassador Miller, he was gone. He had slipped away in the chaos, probably already looking for a new empire to manipulate, a new market for his empty smiles. I didn't care. He was a man of the old world, a man who thought that perfection was something you could buy. He was wrong. Perfection is a cage, and I had just opened the door. Vera leaned her forehead against mine, her copper eyes reflecting the new light of the city. "What happens now, Shield Consort?" she asked. "Now?" I said, feeling the familiar, grinding ache return to my hip. "Now we go find a bar. And then we figure out how to live in a world that isn't perfect." She laughed, a genuine, beautiful sound that echoed through the hall. "I think I can handle that," she said. I closed my eyes, the pain a warm, constant companion in the dark. I was Elias Thorne. I was a man with chronic rheumatism. I was the shield consort to the High Strategus. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for a cure. I was exactly where I was meant to be, broken, scarred, and whole. The silence that followed the collapse of the spire's golden frequency was not empty. It was thick, heavy, and resonant, like the air inside a cathedral after a great bell has stopped swinging. I lay on the floor of the Hall of Iridescence, my cheek pressed against the cold, violet pulsing crystal. My body felt like a house that had been gutted by fire. The structure was still standing, but the interior was nothing but ash and glowing embers. The pain broadcast had cost me more than I could put into words. Every nerve ending felt raw, as if I had been flayed and then dipped in liquid nitrogen. My right hip wasn't just aching, it felt like it had been replaced by a jagged chunk of radioactive slag. But as I lay there, watching the dust motes dance in the new soft light, I felt a strange, terrifying lightness in my chest. I had given them my truth. I had taken 12 years of shame, of hiding, of gritting my teeth through the dark, and I had turned it into a weapon that broke an empire. "Don't you dare close your eyes, Elias," a voice commanded. It was Vera. She was kneeling over me, her silver skin shimmering with a dull, bruised light. Her mercury weave armor was cracked in a dozen places, and for the first time, I saw blood on her, Corithian blood, a shimmering, iridescent fluid that looked like melted pearls. She looked exhausted, battered, and more beautiful than any of the perfect versions of her I'd seen before. "I'm just checking the floor for structural integrity," I rasped. Every word felt like I was swallowing glass. "It's solid. Good job, gearhead." She let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. "The medics are coming. The real ones. Not the ones who look for perfection, but the ones who know how to mend what is broken." I looked around the hall. The chaos had transitioned into a slow, stunned reality. The high senators were sitting on the floor, their elaborate robes torn, their skins showing the fine silver lines of stress fractures. They looked at their own hands with a mixture of horror and wonder. Lord Kalen was being led away by two cracked guards, Orin and a younger worker with a mechanical brace. Kalen wasn't fighting. He was staring at the floor, his skin a muddy, defeated gray. He looked like a man who had been told the sun was a lie. And then there was Miller. The ambassador was standing near the edge of the dais, flanked by his Terran Marines. He looked remarkably unscathed, his suit still mostly pressed, though he was sweating through his collar. He was looking at me, and for the first time, I didn't see a politician. I saw a scared man who realized the world he'd been trying to build had just been dismantled by a sergeant with a limp. "This is a disaster," Miller whispered, his voice shaking. "Sergeant Moss, do you have any idea what you've done? You've destroyed 1,000 years of diplomatic progress. You've handed the most powerful empire in the quadrant to a mob of defects." "They aren't a mob, Miller," I said, struggling to sit up with Vera's help. The kinetic suit gave a pathetic, dying whine, the servos grinding as they forced my joints into position. "They're the people who actually know how this world works. And as for your progress, if progress requires a man to cut out his own soul just to fit in, then it's not progress. It's a funeral. Earth will disavow you, Miller spat, though he backed away as Alara stepped forward, her laser drill held at a low, menacing angle. You'll be a man without a country, a ghost in the machine. I've been a ghost for a long time, Ambassador, I said, looking him dead in the eye. It's not as bad as you think. You get to see things clearly from the shadows. Vera stood up, her hand still resting on my shoulder. She looked at Miller, and the air around her seemed to freeze. The Terran diplomatic mission is terminated, she said, her voice like a shearing glacier. You will leave Korath Prime within the hour. If your vessels are still in our space when the second moon rises, they will be treated as hostile invaders. Your Lazarus 7 protocols and your empty promises are no longer welcome in a house of fire. Miller opened his mouth to protest, but the look in Vera's copper eyes silenced him. He turned and walked away, his Marines following him in a silent, shamed retreat. They knew. They were soldiers too. They knew that Earth had betrayed one of its own, and they knew that the broken man on the floor was the only one who had stood his ground. The next few days were a blur of recovery and transition. I was moved to a new medical wing, one that smelled of earth and herbs rather than ozone and sterile light. It was staffed by the cracked, led by the old man, Oren. They didn't put me in a tank. They used targeted resonance therapy to ease the inflammation and manual manipulation to settle my joints. It was slow, it was painful, but it was honest. Vera visited me every evening. We would sit on the balcony of the medwing, watching the city below. The obsidian spire was changing. The golden light had not returned. Instead, the city was a tapestry of soft violets, deep indigos, and warm ambers. The noise of the revolution had settled into a new kind of harmony, a discordant, complex symphony that reflected the reality of its people. They are calling it the harmony of the shards, Vera said one evening, her hand resting near mine on the crystalline railing. The Senate has voted to abolish the purity codes. The rim colonies are being integrated back into the hegemony. We are learning to be imperfect, Elias. It's a steep learning curve, I said, leaning my head back. My hip was still throbbing, a steady rhythmic ache, but I wasn't fighting it. I was just letting it be. People like things simple. They like things perfect. It makes them feel safe. Realizing that the world is messy and that you're part of the mess, that takes guts. You gave them those guts, she said, turning to face me. Her skin was a soft, peaceful blue. Kalen is in the rim. He is working in the atmospheric plants. He is learning what it means to hurt and what it means to keep going despite it. He hates it, but he is surviving. Good for him, I muttered. Maybe in a few years he'll be human enough to buy a round of drinks. She laughed, that genuine sound that always made the air feel a little warmer. And you, Elias Thorne? What will you do now? The Terran Union has officially stripped you of your rank. You are a civilian, an exile. I looked at my hands. They were scarred, the knuckles swollen, the skin rough. They were the hands of a man who had done 2 tours on Kepler 442b and 1 revolution on Korath Prime. I think I'm done being a soldier, Vera, I said. I think I've spent enough time trying to fix the world with a gun and a mine. Maybe I'll try fixing it with a bit of noise instead. I hear the cracked are looking for someone to help design new mobility aids. Someone who understands the terrain. They are, she said, her copper eyes shining. And I am looking for a shield consort who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm being a silver-skinned idiot. Well, I said, reaching out to take her hand. Her blood was warm, her skin solid and real. I'm pretty overqualified for that second part. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the violet sun set over a city that was no longer perfect, but was finally, for the first time in 10,000 years, alive. I knew the road ahead would be hard. I knew my rheumatism wasn't going away. I knew there would be days when the fire in my bones would make me want to scream. But I also knew I wouldn't be screaming alone. And that, I realized, was the only cure I had ever really needed. 6 months later, the obsidian spire was a different world. The living crystal had adapted to the new resonance. The walls were no longer smooth and uniform. They had grown textures, ripples, and even scars where the history of the revolution had etched itself into the foundation. It was beautiful in a way that the old city could never have been. a beauty of character, of survival, and of shared history. I was walking through the Garden of Resonances, a park that had once been reserved for the highest nobility. Now it was filled with people from all walks of Corinthian life. I saw a group of children playing tag, their laughter echoing through the crystalline trees. Among them was a little Corinthian boy with a prosthetic leg made of black polymer and silver wire, a design I had helped Alara perfect. He wasn't the fastest kid in the group, but he was the most determined, his face set in a grin of pure, unadulterated joy as he chased his friends. I wasn't wearing the kinetic assist suit anymore. Not today. I was using a cane. It was carved from a single piece of Korath Prime's deep bedrock obsidian, capped with a silver handle in the shape of a Terran lion. It was heavy, and it clinked against the crystal path with every step, a steady, rhythmic sound that marked my progress. My right knee gave a sharp, familiar jab of protest. I paused, leaning my weight onto the cane, and took a breath of the ozone-sweet air. Taking a tactical pause, Sergeant? I didn't have to turn around to know it was Vera. She was walking toward me, her stride no longer the predatory, cinematic blur it had once been. She moved with a measured, deliberate grace, her skin a soft, swirling violet. She wasn't wearing her armor today. She wore a simple robe of woven shadow, the same kind she had worn in my room when everything was falling apart. "Just enjoying the scenery, your radiance," I said, giving her a lopsided smile, and checking if the gravity is still working. "It's a bit heavy this afternoon." She stopped beside me, her shoulder brushing mine. She didn't offer to carry me. She didn't look at my cane with pity. She just stood with me, her presence a silent, solid support. "The new Senate session begins in an hour," she said. "They are debating the Universal Accessibility Act. There is still resistance from some of the older houses. They say it makes the spire look cluttered." "Clutter is just life happening, Vera," I said, tapping my cane against the path. "A house that's too clean isn't a home, it's a museum. Tell them that if they want a museum, they can go move to the moons. This is a city of the living." "I shall tell them exactly that," she said, a spark of amusement in her eyes. "But I think they would prefer to hear it from the Iron Soul himself. Will you speak today?" I looked at the Hall of Iridescence, glowing in the distance like a giant violet heart. "I think I've done enough talking for a while, Vera. I think it's time for the others to speak." "Ilara's got the floor first, right?" "She does. She is going to present the new sensory integration maps for the lower levels. She has become quite the formidable politician." "She had a good teacher," I said, and I felt a genuine warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with medicine. We walked together toward the hall, the sound of my cane and her footsteps creating a new kind of music on the crystalline path. I saw Oren sitting on a bench, teaching a group of young engineers how to calibrate an acoustic dampener. He looked up and waved, his single silver eye shining. I nodded back, a silent acknowledgement of the brotherhood we shared. As we reached the entrance of the hall, I stopped and looked back at the city. I thought about the man I had been when I first arrived on Korath Prime. I had been 32 years old and I had felt like my life was already over. I had seen myself as a collection of failures, a broken soldier, a defective body, a man whose only value was as a joke for an alien court. I had spent every waking moment trying to hide who I was, trying to pretend that the pain wasn't there, trying to be whole in a way that didn't exist. I realized now how wrong I had been. My pain wasn't a failure. It was my perspective. My scars weren't a source of shame. They were my credentials. They were the proof that I had faced the void and come back again and again. I hadn't become the most feared man in the Corinthian Empire because I was strong. I had become that man because I was the only one who knew how to handle being weak. The Corinthians had lived in a dream of perfection, and they had been terrified of waking up. I had woken them up, and in doing so, I had finally woken up myself. I wasn't a whole man in the way Miller had promised. My hips still ground like a rusted hinge. My back still felt like it was being woven together with barbed wire. My hands still shook on the cold mornings. But I was whole in a way that I had never been before. I was a man who accepted his flaws as part of his strength. I was a man who knew that a broken blade, if held by a steady hand, could still change the course of history. I looked at Vera, who was waiting for me at the door. She wasn't waiting for a hero. She wasn't waiting for a god. She was waiting for me. "Ready, Elias?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, gripping my cane and taking the first step into the hall. "I'm ready." I walked into the center of the chamber, the same place where I had stood 6 months ago, counting my heartbeats to keep from fainting. Today, I didn't count my heartbeats. I listened to the sound of my cane. I listened to the murmurs of the Senate. I listened to the resonance of a world that was finally, gloriously, imperfectly free. I took my seat beside Vera, not as a jester, not as a prisoner, but as a partner. I looked out at the faces of the Corinthian people, the silver-skinned, the gray-patched, the mechanical-limbed, and the scarred. They were all beautiful. And as Alara stood up to speak, I felt a single quiet tear roll down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of pain. It was a tear of recognition. I had found my home. Not in a place without pain, but in a place where pain was understood. Not in a world of perfection, but in a world of fire. I leaned back in my chair, the violet light of the spire warming my face, and I closed my eyes. For the first time in 12 years, the war was over. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I spent 12 years of my life thinking that my body was a prison. I looked at my scars and my swollen joints as the bars of a cell that kept me from being the man I was supposed to be. I thought that if I could just find a cure, if I could just be whole again, then my life would finally start. I was waiting for a door to open that had been locked since that explosion on Kepler 442b. But standing here in the violet light of Korath Prime, I realized that the door was never locked. I was just looking at the wrong side of it. My pain didn't make me less. It made me more. It gave me a grit that the perfect people around me couldn't even fathom. It forced me to be creative, to be stubborn, and to find value in things that other people took for granted. We live in a galaxy that worships the unscarred. We spend our lives trying to airbrush our mistakes, hide our traumas, and pretend that we are indestructible. But the truth is, the only things that are truly indestructible are the things that have already been broken and found a way to knit back together. Strength isn't about never falling. It's about what you do with the pieces of yourself after you hit the ground. I'm still broken. I always will be. But I've learned that a broken soul can carry a lot more weight than a perfect one ever could. And that is the only perfection I'll ever need. Spent a long time being ashamed of the parts of me that were damaged, only to find that those were the very parts that saved a world. I wonder, what is that one thing about yourself you have been trying so hard to hide or fix because you think it makes you less? What would happen if you stopped seeing it as a flaw and started seeing it as your greatest strength? I gripped the handle of my obsidian cane, the silver lion cold against my palm, and took a slow, steady breath. The violet sun was high in the sky, and for the first time in my life, the road ahead didn't look like an ordeal. It looked like a beginning.